I honestly wish that more people knew this. If we had common understanding like this given to us when we were young around debt and how you can retire financially free, we would all be much happier, in my opinion. In this video, I want to share with you how you can go ahead and get $1 million in real estate value debt-free. And I'm going to show you in the most simplest way possible, discussing interest only versus principal and interest loans. So if you're interested in what my thoughts are, then definitely keep watching. Hey guys, my name's Ravi and welcome back to Personal Finance with Ravi Sharma. If you're new here, smash that subscribe button because I talk about real estate, cryptocurrency, and financial freedom. Now, I also run one of the fastest growing buyers agencies in Australia, and we've bought over 1,000 properties across all of Australia. So I know a thing or two when it comes to property and research. Now, when it comes to banks and what structures you need to have, I'm definitely not a broker, but I definitely know how this stuff works. But I'm going to share with you my opinion and my take on how you can accelerate your growth when it comes to real estate. And if you only have intentions to buy 1, 2, or 3 properties in your entire lifetime, why not make them the best purchases ever and structure them the right way? Now, anything I talk about in this video is not financial advice and is definitely not credit advice because, again, I'm some guy on YouTube wearing a black t-shirt that eats KFC. Like, how can you take me seriously when it comes to this sort of stuff? But if you take some value away from this, I promise you, you'll get so much more if you subscribe to the channel and definitely like this video. Now, when you decide you're gonna buy a home, whether it's to live in or an investment property, you'll be faced with one big question. Do I go interest only or interest plus principal? Now, fun fact, when I started investing into real estate, I often scratched my head when I got told interest only might be a better option. And at that point, I was like, this makes no sense because if I'm interest only, I don't pay any debt down. And at some point, I want to be debt free. So how do I do that? And I always got told by people much smarter than me, they're like, trust the process, go interest only, increase your cash flow, and then you can go and retire debt free anyway. And I said, please explain. Well, that's why I create videos like this, because those people aren't around anymore, and I want to make this video accessible to people like yourself. So let's define what interest only is and principal and interest, and then you can decide what move makes more sense. Now, interest only is you going out and just paying the cost of the loan. So when you take out debt, you're basically faced with an interest repayment to the bank. The bank says, hey, I'll give you all this money, but you've got to give me some interest. And that interest is just the cost of borrowing. And at the current interest rate of 6.5%, the easiest way to calculate this would be knowing what your loan amount is times 6.5% or whatever rate you're on at the time. Now, I'm going to show you an example in a second and the difference between the two, but it's just important to know what the difference is. Now, that's just interest only. You're just paying the cost of borrowing that money, but not the actual balance. Interest plus principal is exactly that. Interest, which is the cost, you're still paying that, but I'm also going to pay down that principal. That large amount of debt that I took on, I want to slowly pay that off after every repayment I make. So there's a portion there that's a cost, which is the interest, and then there's a portion that's your actual debt, the principal, and that slowly goes down over time. And the idea is that if you made all your repayments over 30 years, at the end of 30 years, you'll have a house completely paid off. That's the idea. But there are ways to pay it off even faster. Now, I'm going to share with you what would be counterintuitive, and to be honest, at this point, 99% of people that watch this video probably still won't do it. And that's how the 1% get richer, because they think outside the box. And this is actually quite simple. And the reason why interest only can get you filthy rich and get you $1 million place completely debt-free is because of cash flow. Now, when you go ahead and purchase property and you're going out there building up your portfolio, what's the one thing that's going to stop you from actually going and holding those properties? It's cash flow. And we already know the goal of this game is to hold as many assets for as long as possible. So it's time in the market, right? So you want to go out there, accumulate all your assets, and then hold for as long as possible. Now, the only thing that could stop you from holding is because you can't afford to hold, and that would be your negative cash flow. So let's say, for example, you go out there, you purchase one property in Sydney, and it's negative cash flow by $20,000 a year. So if you are out there right now making $100,000, $200,000, whatever that number is, at the end of the day, you're left with, say, $30,000. $20,000 goes towards holding that one piece of real estate. You're left with $10,000 a year, and that goes into savings. Now, could you go and buy a second property like that? Well, maybe your borrowing capacity allows you to, but on a cash flow basis, you couldn't do it because now you've only left with $10,000. If you were to take on another property that was negative $20,000, you couldn't do it, right? And the same would apply if you actually ended up losing your job. So if you had that scenario play out, you lose your job, you can't afford to hold that one piece of real estate, $20,000, which means you have to sell. So cash flow is very important when it comes to holding and retaining assets. Capital growth is super important, and that's how you're gonna get rich. But the cash flow allows you to stay in the game for as long as possible. Now let's look at an example. I'm just gonna share my screen here, and I'm gonna show you first the difference between interest only and principal and interest in terms of cash flow, and then why these assets that you purchase today could mean that you retire a millionaire in the next 30 years. All right, so I'm here on a home loan repayments calculator, and we're gonna say that the amount that we're borrowing is $600,000. Over the period of 30 years, if we just went principal and interest and we said input our rate of 6.5%, we can see that our monthly repayments would be $3,793. Over the life of the loan, we'll end up paying it off in 30 years time, and the total repayments will have been 1.365 million, and the total interest charged is $765,000. As soon as someone watches this part of the video, they'll say, this is such a dumb idea. Why would I actively go and pay $765,000 to a bank when I can just go ahead, try and pay it off as quickly as possible and just be done with it? I'll save all those interest costs, right? And that's how the 99% think. Just bear with me. And if it still doesn't make sense, you can still go down that path. But when you're gonna see what the numbers look like by doing it this way, you're gonna realize why some people end up filthy rich with a lot of money. Now, if I decided to change this and I went to interest only, that would then mean that my repayments have dropped by about $500 per month. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but the reality is that could be the difference between me holding one property versus two properties. So in this example, let's say we did go interest only, and it allowed us, based on our cash flow, to hold one extra property. That means we could buy two instead of one. Now, obviously you've got to consider other things like your upfront costs. Do you even have the cash or the equity? And more importantly, do you even have the borrowing capacity to purchase the two properties? Let's assume that you do have the capacity, and let's assume you have enough of a deposit. Instead of using a 20% deposit on one property, you use 10% deposits on two properties. So let's assume that's the case. Well, now the next part to this is to realize how much your property will have grown in the next 30 years. But before we do that, one of the most frequently asked questions about interest-only loans are, Ravi, if I'm interest only and it's for 1 year, or if it's for 5 years, that's the maximum I can do. So what happens after that? Do I go interest plus principal? Well, that's really up to you. If you decide at that point you have no intentions to acquire more assets, you can go into debt reduction strategies, and you can start paying off your loan, and you can even go and put more money towards it to pay off your loan even faster. Alternatively, if you feel like you're still wanting to acquire more assets, you can simply go out there, refinance, and get another 5 years of interest-only repayments as well. So the term can be changed over once you've refinanced. There are options out there. So don't get scared if you think it's just a short-term thing. There are definitely options out there. So let's assume we've gone ahead and we bought one $700,000 property at an average growth rate of 6%, and we did this over 30 years. What would that actually look like? And we can see after 30 years that one property we bought, if it grew by 6% every single year and it compounded, it would be worth now $4 million. So we go back to the first example of where we spoke about paying $775,000 of interest. If that meant that my property for $700,000 is now worth $4 million, it would make sense, because I've made $3.3 million, but I paid $700K on top of what my initial investment was. So that to me is a pretty fair bet. Where it gets even better is if I can realize that I go interest only, use my deposits as two deposits rather than one, it allows me to purchase a second property. Now, what does that look like? Now, what I've done here is I've gone ahead and purchased two investment properties at $700K each. Now, the initial investment looks like 1.4 million. Again, at 6% growth rate, it means that the total value is worth $8 million. Now, here's the kicker. You still have debt on there, right? And that's what we want to remove. If we held this for 30 years, you have the option to go and sell one property for $4 million and pay off the debt on both homes. If your debt initially to start off with was, say, 600K on the first property and 600K on the second property, it means your total debt is about 1.2 million. So if you're getting $4 million and your debt's 1.2, even after taxes and costs for selling, you're going to be able to knock off all of that debt and have one house completely debt-free, which would be worth $4 million in 30 years' time. Now, obviously, we don't know if the market's going to grow by 6% every year. It could be 3%, it could be 4%, but the reality is 6% is even lower than what the long-term average in growth rates are in Australia. So I'm being conservative here. So this all makes sense to be able to hold more assets, and you could do this and replicate this to say, well, what happens if I have 5 properties? What about 6 properties? Well, you do the same thing. It might require you to only sell 3 out of the 6, or maybe it's 2 out of the 7 properties, and the rest of your portfolio would be completely debt-free. Now, this is working on 30-year projections. How do I get to $1 million? So let's say I only need the properties that I purchased for 600K or 700K to basically get me to a point where I'm left with $1 million in net equity. Can I get there quicker? And that's when we can come down here, which is our yearly breakdown. And all this means is that our initial value is 1.4 million, and every year it compounds and increases. So in the first year, it grows by 84,000, in the next year, 89,000, in the year after, 94,000, and it continues to increase because it's compounding growth. The value of our properties continue to increase. So what we would essentially try and do is to try and get $1 million worth of net equity and be in a position where I could sell one property, knock off all of my debt, which would be 1.2 million. So I need to be in a position where I have 2.2 million in equity. So all I would do is look at my initial balance, which is 1.4, and I would look to get 2.2 million in equity, which means I need this number to be closer to 3.6 to 3.7 million dollars. And when I scroll down, I can see that in year 16 to 17 is when I would achieve that point. So what I could do at this point is simply go ahead, sell the one property. I would be able to pay off the debt on one property, pay off the debt on the second property, and I would be in a position where I would have more than $1 million in net equity in my real estate portfolio. This is just with one property being sold to hold one. Imagine trying to do this across 3 and holding for 3, or going ahead and building a portfolio of 8 or 9 properties that actually are in the right location and grow much faster than 6%. You can see how easy it is to go down this method and increase your value through your portfolio. Building the machine is what I've been talking about for years and years. This is how you do it. And if you simply go in and say, well, I want to pay off the debt, you should pay off the debt when it comes time for you to pay off the debt. If you're in accumulation mode, you're trying to take on more debt. So I would go on to argue to say, if you're taking on more debt to acquire more assets, why would you pay off your principal anyway? If you've enjoyed this video and it's made sense, smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you need help with buying the right real estate and you were like, I don't want to do this, I don't know how to research, or I just don't have the time, then definitely use the link in the description below. Go ahead and book a free call with my team. I hope you guys have enjoyed this one. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks, guys.